So today we're going to talk about farm animals in particular, and we'll focus mainly on horses, cows, and sheep. So we have a little bit of a difference between ruminants and horses. So ruminants include cows and sheep and goats, and hindgut fermenters are horses. They're both herbivores, meaning that they only eat plant material. And in fact, these guys, both ruminants and hindgut fermenters, they acquire so much more nutrients from plant materials than dogs and cats. They're able to readily break down that insoluble fiber that for omnivores and carnivores is impossible to break down. So hindgut fermenters, most of the breakdown and nutrient absorption takes place in the cecum, and they ferment pre-digested materials. So that means that the insoluble fiber in the foodstuffs makes its way through their digestive tract. It gets digested in the stomach through chemical and mechanical digestion, and then it gets further broken down, which is really, really important, through fermentation in their cecum. So it gets digested first and then fermented in their cecum. Ruminants, on the other hand, most of the breakdown takes place in the stomach chambers. And in the stomach chambers in particular, the rumen, that is where fermentation takes place. So their fermentation takes place in the rumen first, and then it carries on through the other chambers of the stomach and ends up in the abomasum, where it undergoes chemical digestion. So herbivores ferment pre-digested material, whereas ruminants digest pre-fermented material. So water is key for ruminants and hindgut fermenters. It's key for all animals, as we've learned, but it may be surprising exactly how much water these animals require. So I'm just going to skip over to this link that I've made available to you on the PowerPoint. So let's read it. Water. Water requirements depend largely on environmental conditions, amount of work or physical activity being performed, type and amount of feed, and physiological status of the horse. Now, this also goes hand in hand with ruminants as well as horses. The minimal maintenance daily water requirement of a sedentary adult horse, so i.e., a horse that's inactive in a thermoregulated environment, so an environment that's not too cold, not too hot, is 5 liters of water per 100 kilograms of body weight a day. However, a 500 kilogram horse will usually drink 21 to 29 liters of water per day when fed a mixed hay and grain ration or pasture. If fed only dry hay, water intake will almost double. So for horses that are only getting dry hay, whether it's alfalfa hay, timothy hay, etc., they could have upwards of 60 liters of water per day that they need. Lactation, or sweat losses, also increase the body needs by 50 to 200% for water intake. So a 500 kilogram horse exercising for 1 hour in a hot environment will need to drink 72 to 92 liters of water to replace the sweat and evaporative losses. Lactating mares need 12 to 14 liters per 100 kilograms of body weight to sustain good health and milk production. That is a ton of water. So what that means is that when you are feeding horses and cows and ruminants in general, always ensure that they have access to clean, fresh, copious amounts of water. Oftentimes with horses and cows, we'll use automatic waterers. So in the wintertime, the goal of the waterer is to heat the water with a little heater coil underneath the bowl to prevent icing and to continuously fill up that water bowl. So they continuously fill and they're heated to prevent icing. So it's your responsibility as a caretaker to go through and ensure that there's not hay, there's not dirt, there's not drool accumulating in the water bowls or in the water troughs to ensure that they have fresh, drinkable water source. Super, super, super important. So feedstuffs, which is a weird word, but feedstuffs is a term that we give to all the different components of herbivore diets. So we have more than that, 5 essential groupings of feedstuffs. Forages, also called roughages, are the number one feedstuffs in an herbivore diet, and it's all or most of the plant. We have concentrates, byproducts, mineral and vitamin supplements, and then non-nutritional additives. It's important when we're looking at all these various components to note their potential for spoilage, and we'll talk about a couple different methods of storage that can result in higher levels of spoilage than others. And spoilage could mean mold, it could mean fungus, deterioration of the feedstuffs in general. So forages. Forages are typically legumes or grass products. They're high in fiber, low in energy density, and high in bulk. So essentially, they're the insoluble fiber that dogs and cats can't digest. We'll talk a little bit about rotational grazing, ensiling, and hay. So forages fed to livestock belong to either the legume or grass plant families. They typically have, forages in general, typically have large amounts of fiber, low energy density, and high bulk, as mentioned above. Legumes that are commonly used for forage production include alfalfa, red and white clover, bird's foot trefoil, and vetch. Grasses offer more variety for forage production and include various types of hays. Also included in the grasses, we have bluegrass, fescue timothy, which timothy hay is quite common, and Sudan grass. Other grass forages that can be used for cereal grain production are oats, rye, wheat, corn, and sorghum. And of these, corn is the most important forage and cereal grain product grown for livestock. So then we get into rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is a more controlled method of grazing, and it's often being adopted for horses and for agricultural animals in general. In this method, animals are allowed to graze restricted areas of forage for limited periods of time, and then they're shifted into another area to graze that specific area. So this allows the grazing crop to regrow itself until the animals are returned for grazing. With a highly managed rotational grazing, the forage quality is very, very high, and it maintains a lower cost to the farmer. Ensiling is a word you might not have heard of, but it means it's a process by which harvested forage is chopped and then placed into a storage unit, i.e. a silo, which excludes oxygen. So those big silos that you see when you drive by farms, they have the oxygen removed from the grain or from the forage that's within them. As the forage ferments in the silo, lactic acid is produced, which essentially pickles the forage. So it creates a partially fermented state called silage. Good quality silage can be stored indefinitely in upright silos or plastic fermentation containers. And it's important, the key of a silo is the exclusion of oxygen. Now, that being said, we often use silage, so silage material for ruminants. We often don't use it for horses because there always is the potential when a forage is left for so long in a container that there are minuscule amounts of spoilage. So this could mean small amounts of molds, of fungus, and other types of growth, which ruminants can ferment and get rid of quite easily. Horses are much more sensitive to this, so we typically don't use ensiling for horses. Hay, lastly, is forage that's cut and allowed to dry before being collected into bales for storage. So essentially, unlike silo material, hay is allowed to dry and then it's stored. Concentrates. So concentrates are another foodstuffs additive, low fiber, high energy or protein. Common forms are cereal and fats. So I'm going to read you the wrong slide. So concentrates are generally low in fiber, high in energy and protein, as noted above. Cereal grains such as barley, corn, millet, oats, rye, sorghum, and wheat are the seeds of many of the grass species that we talked about in regard to forages. Corn, again, is the most common grain fed to livestock and the standard with which others are compared. Cereal grains contain large amounts of energy in the form of starch and are added to diets to increase energy density. Other feed products used as energy concentrates include molasses, root crops like turnips, beets, and carrots, and potatoes, and fats and oils of plant products or animal origin contain 2.25 times the energy density of carbohydrates and are also used as energy concentrates. So byproducts, we talk about byproducts are in regard to residues. So byproduct feeds are residues of the feed processing industry, and they span an array of feedstuffs. So examples of byproduct feeds include sugar, beet pulp, bakery waste, blood, bone meal, brewer's grain, tallow, and whey, so milk whey. Many byproduct feeds contain substantial amounts of fermentable fiber, energy, and protein. Minerals and vitamins. Minerals and vitamin supplements and are sources of individual or combination minerals with or without the vitamins. So fat-soluble vitamins are supplemented primarily in the form of premixed diets, and they're typically given to ruminants in particular. Going back. The reason that they're typically given to ruminants is because fat-soluble vitamins have a higher likelihood of spoilage, kind of like the silo type material. So they have a higher likelihood of growing molds, fungus, etc. And again, ruminants can digest that. They typically can bypass that, ferment it, whereas horses are much more sensitive. Certain water-soluble vitamins may be supplemented in swine and horse diets, and they're not typically given to ruminant diets. And the way that they're often provided to the animal is either in a premixed diet, so they might be sprayed onto the grain or onto the particular type of forage that the horse or cow is eating, and then given to the horse, or a common way for minerals and vitamins to be provided to horses, cows, and sheep is through a salt lick or a mineral lick. And then they're drawn to the salt and they continuously lick to acquire the minerals and vitamins that they need. So then we have non-nutritive, say that 10 times fast, feed additives. So these can include buffers, hormones, binders, and medications. Typical feed medications can include antibiotics, antifungals, anthelmintics, antiparasitics, and other medications that are common. Their use is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA of Canada, and that's to ensure that the farmer is producing a high quality product. So the risk with any medication being added to the food is the likelihood that it will stay in the meat product if it's being sold for meat or being passed on into the milk product. And also we have to consider things if it is a racing horse, so a horse that's being used for racing or for competition. Caution is to just be careful with any type of medication that's used to ensure that it's not going to be considered a performance enhancing drug, because that could skew the results of a race. Okay, so moving on to specific requirements for dairy cattle. Dairy cattle are typically segregated and housed by their production stages, and they're fed according to specific nutrition requirements. So within those stages are milk-fed calves, growing replacement heifers, so heifers that aren't quite adult yet, but they will be, so they're being tuned up to be the milking cows, non-lactating pregnant cows, and lactation groups. Lactation groups are usually based on the level of milk production specific to them as well. And then in large dairies, so really large dairy farms, the most common type of feed delivery is by total mixed rations. And in this system, all individual feed ingredients are mechanically mixed into a feed wagon and presented in a single mixture to the cows. So the goal of that is to allow the cows not to be picky, because sometimes they like certain components of the food more than others, but to allow a premix to be delivered at the same time to be cost efficient and provide the cows sorting through the type of material that they want to eat. And it ends up being a nice, rounded, well-maintained diet. Really important too with dairy production as well as beef production cattle, but dairy production is to always be looking at the body condition score, because a lot of the food in general is based on body condition scoring of the animal. And dairy cattle and beef cattle do have different body condition scoring charts, which I didn't post for you. Perhaps I'll find them and repost them. But we always want to make sure that we're following the body condition score, because if a lactating female is showing signs that she's becoming emaciated or thin, then she might need to have, rather than the premixed ration food, she might need to have additives supplemented into her diet. So body condition scoring, same with dogs and cats, it's either a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 9 scale. Very, very important that when you are body condition scoring an animal, you write your score out of the total. So if it's a score of 1, you need to ensure that you're writing it out of 5 or out of 9. Otherwise, if you're giving an animal a score of 3, which is ideal on the 1 to 5 scale, so 1 to 5 scale, 3 is ideal. If we are giving it a 3 out of 9, that means that it's thin. So it gives a comparison compared to the overall outcomes of the particular scale that's being used. So beef cattle, there's different methods of feeding them. We have cow-calf operations, and then cattle or feedlot operations. And the ultimate goal with feeding livestock in general is to produce a high quality product. So in this case, it would be a high quality meat. In dairy, it would be high quality milk with low costs. Cost is key. And food cost equates to 60% of the overall operational costs of dairy and of beef cattle production. So forage is considered the largest part of the diet for calf-cow operations, and they typically allow the calves and cows to graze open pastures with protein, fat, and vitamin supplements being provided to the diet. So the amount of which the other additives, so the fat, protein, minerals, vitamins, are added to the diet as supplementation will depend on the level of quality of the forage that they're acquiring on their own. For cattle or feedlot cattle, it's all about the desired level of growth from weaning to slaughter. So there's specific mechanisms in place that dictate how much calves should grow within a certain period of time. And then once they're weaned, it's getting the optimal amount of growth for the lowest cost. So ensuring that that beef is growing quite significantly without significant cost to the farmer. Calves are typically placed on a low-cost pasture and supplementation feeding program to gain weight at a moderate rate. And then feedlot goal, so once they're shifted from weaning into the feedlot, the goal is to maximize the rate of growth and to feed for the lowest cost. So when weanlings come, so little calves who have just been weaned, the percentage of forage is slowly reduced and concentrates are increased. Byproducts for feedlot cows are usually heavily utilized, so they start adding in those byproducts that we talked about earlier in order to maximize cost effectiveness and desired growth. So again, cattle that's being raised for beef, really, really important to get maximum growth for lowest level of cost. And just the main difference between lactating and dairy cows is that often byproducts are used fairly heavily in feedlot cows. When we're talking about calves in general for both beef cattle and dairy cattle, colostrum is extremely important for the newborn calf. So colostrum is the product that comes through the nipple of the cow before the milk actually starts flowing. And colostrum includes a whole bunch of globulins and antibodies and all this sort of top quality requirements for the immune system of the calf to function at ideal quality. So colostrum is a fluid. It's clear or slightly yellow, and it comes within the first 24 hours from the cow. And the first 24 hours of colostrum intake is key in order to raise a healthy calf to cow. The suckling reflex of a calf is a really good indicator of calf health. Dairy calves are often limited in the amount of milk that they're provided from their mums. Typically, dairy cows are only allowed 10% of milk intake before they're taken away from their mum, and that's to help decrease the amount of time that they're actually feeding from their mum, so that they can be weaned and the milk can be taken to produce dairy. So I hope that makes sense. So colostrum are the immunoglobulins and antibodies that are passed on from mum within the first 24 hours, so from the cattle within the first 24 hours to the calf, and really, really, really important for them to get that colostrum. The suckling reflex is key, so as soon as a calf, and this goes for horses as well, but as soon as the calf is born, we want to make sure that the calf is suckling and actually getting colostrum while they're suckling. And that's a key indicator, because if a calf is hypoglycemic, if they're having gastrointestinal issues, if they're sick, then often they won't suckle. So the suckling reflex is really important in determining the health of the calf right away. And then just to further reiterate my point, calves and in general, if a calf is allowed to suckle on their own, then they will typically take on 20 to 30% of their body weight in milk. So they will feed a lot when they're on their own nursing from mum. However, dairy cows are different. The farmers reduce the amount that they allow them to feed, and they only allow them to feed 10% of their body weight. And the goal of that is to be able to keep the cow nursing, so keep the cow producing milk, but more so that they can take that milk and sell it rather than provide it to the little calves. All right, so moving on to horses. So the need for energy, protein, and mineral vitamin supplementation is going to depend on the forage quality and nutrients requirements of that horse. Corn, barley, and oats are common grains to feed to horses for added energy. And recently, fat supplementation has been advocated to provide energy for growing, lactating, and working horses. So pasture and hay are the very most common methods for feeding horses, although we typically also give them preformed grain and pellet diets that have specific balances of protein, fat, and nutrients. Silage, again, is not recommended for horses because of their sensitivity to molds, to changes in fermentation, to bacteria, etc., that potentially could develop in silo type forage. But premix formulas for horses are really common. So at Seneca, if you're ever feeding the horses, we typically are giving them not only free range to forage outside, and we do rotate their pastures as well, but they also get the premix formulas of grain pellets and of different even types of hay pellets. With horses, it's really important to keep up on their parasite control as well, because parasites can really take away from their nutritional absorption. And also, horses have the propensity to have dental issues. So, horses often have to have their teeth floated. So, that means that their teeth, the molars at the back of their mouth, often grow abnormally. And there's certain reasons that this might happen, more likely in certain horses than others. But if a horse is not eating, one of the first things that's checked is their back molars to see if there's any sharp areas or uneven areas that might need to be filed down by the vet. So dental care in horses is really, really important, and it's really important for the doctor to check that right away if the horse is not eating, because it's a common cause of inappetence. So sheep, we typically follow a regime common to that of beef cattle. And so again, sheep, it depends if they're being used for milk or for meat. Most often it is for meat here in Ontario. So they typically follow that whole weaning protocol where forage is reduced once they're weaned. Slowly forage is reduced and the byproducts are introduced and increased in order to create a larger sheep for meat. So increase growth with little cost to the farmer. Forage is still key in general to sheep diets. So you'll notice that all of the animals that we talked about, all the agricultural herbivores that we talked about, forage is number one. So we talked about the insoluble fibers as it relates to dogs and cats. And of course, we bulk up their diets with insoluble fibers. But herbivore agricultural animals rely on insoluble fibers as the key nutritional component to their diets. Sheep have a really great mechanism in their brains. They are selective grazers. So they do very well to keep costs down and quality up in regard to their forage, because when they're allowed to free roam and have pasture on their own, so go out to the fields and graze, they will actually choose the best nutritional quality grasses. So they will leave out the grasses that they know have little nutritional value, and they'll choose the ones that have the best levels of protein, fat, and nutrients in order to get the most for their bodies. Which is pretty amazing because horses and cows will non-selectively graze, and that is also why cows especially can get into trouble with randomly eating things like wire and metals in the field, and cause issues in their stomachs because cows will just eat. They don't think really about what they're eating. And then same with horses and cows, but very common with sheep. We often provide mineral and vitamin supplementation through the use of a salt lick. So they're drawn to lick the salt, and then we're actually giving them vitamins and minerals through the salt lick as well. So nutrition has a really important relation to overall body condition for agricultural herbivore animals. When we're performing a physical exam, it's important to assess hair coat, body condition scoring, hoof quality, hydration, manure quality. So is it typical cow patty? Is it typical fairly formed manure that's common for horses? Or is it diarrhea? As well as attitude. And it's really important to talk to those involved in the care of the animals and in the actual feeding of the animals. So changes, especially drastic and quick changes to the ratios of forage, byproducts, and other components of nutrients in an herbivore's diet, especially an agricultural herbivore, can lead to really major digestive issues such as bloat. It can lead to hoof changes in the horses called laminitis, and all sorts of medical conditions can creep up that are strictly related to diet and nutrition. So it's really important to have a good grasp on the nutritional requirements of herbivores and how horses differ from cows and from sheep, and always be aware of what your horse or cow is being fed and talk to those involved, because what we often find at Seneca is if an animal outside, one of the agricultural farm animals, is having an issue with their digestive tract, or if they're having lameness and it might be related to diet, sometimes we find that communication wasn't clear And perhaps the horse was given the wrong food. A horse that has a very specific requirement may have been given the wrong food. And in a worst case, which has happened before, sometimes the horse has even been given sheep food, which can have really serious impact on their overall physical condition. So communication is really, really, really key with nutrition in general, but specifically with agricultural herbivores. And that is that.